writings on how the media work. And I would like to...
Or don't work.
Or don't work. That's a very good point. You've written also extensively on the way Israel and the friends of Israel around the world, how they manipulate the media.
They're not actually, let me interrupt you, they're not friends of Israel, they're friends of the Likud party. They're friends of the Israeli right wing.
Right.
Remember, there's a very substantial Jewish American population which are totally against what Israel does. Let's not make this a Jewish thing. We're talking about, maybe they are members of the Jewish American community, but we're talking about people who support Likud, not necessarily people who support Israel, and certainly not all members of the Jewish community throughout the world.
Okay, all right, I'll take this on board. But I would also like to remind you of the situation with one of my colleagues from whom I've also learned a lot, Jeremy Bowen. You know, that he is such a good journalist, TV journalist, always endeavors to be fair and balanced. But he was singled out by the BBC Trust. And I know you don't like this word, trust.
No, not in the BBC context, I don't know. Actually, he was not singled out by the BBC. He was singled out by an outfit called Camera, which is a very meretricious organisation operating out of the United States.
But the BBC Trust went along with... Yeah, the BBC Trust went along.
Yeah, they did. It was absolutely disgraceful, and I wrote that at the time. I thought they were cowardly, gutless. This is the same BBC, remember, which refused to carry an advertisement for medical aid for Palestinian children in case it damaged their neutrality.
Right.
In other words, a child without an arm is worth less than the BBC's neutrality. Excuse me. I thought the so-called trust was cowardly, gutless, pathetic. Jeremy Bowen's a fine reporter. I wrote a piece in the paper saying, you know, he's the guy you trust. You don't trust the BBC. So that's my reply to your question about poor old Jeremy in that instance, yes.
Is it because the Arabs are not doing what they are supposed to do to try and explain the position to the world, or is it because the Israelis are smarter, more hardworking, and the rest of it, you know it?
Look, there's three things basically. Well, there's four elements here. Number one is, for a long time, the West has had the Middle East explained to it by newspapers, television, governments, which, if they're not frightened of the Israelis and the power of the lobby, have more or less gone along with the story. Poor little Israel, surrounded by all these horrible Arab enemies, even those they've made peace with, etc., so we're on Israel's side. Built onto this is the fear among many journalists that merely to criticize Israel honestly and justifiably will bring upon them the outrageous slander of being accused of anti-Semitism, which I threaten legal action over if anyone says that about me. I'm not an anti-Semite. Add to this as well the fact that the Israelis do work hard on their propaganda, that they always produce a spokesman who speaks perfect English or perfect French or perfect German or perfect Russian, whereas the Arabs put no serious reflection into presenting an Arab point of view, because there isn't an Arab point of view. I mean, the Arabs are all fighting each other. Even the lobbies in the United States spend more energy attacking each other than they do trying to balance the issues of the Middle East. And when you get a situation where, for example, Yasser Arafat, who I think was a very corrupt man, a very nepotistic man, he was appointing, you know, a relative to become his spokesman at the United Nations, a man who could hardly speak English, who was then put up against an Israeli ambassador to the UN who spoke absolutely flawless English. I mean, Netanyahu speaks with a Manhattan accent.
Better than the Americans.
I mean, you're not going to win that war, are you?
No, I take your point, and which is a very good point. But I would also like to move on to the situation in Egypt. You've been here recently. And please don't get me fired or deported back to London.
I was wondering if you were going to say that. I've actually been to Egypt, I calculate now, about 192 times in 34 years, so I know Egypt pretty well. And I was there for the food riots in '77, Sadat and so on. Right. Yeah, go on. What's your question about Egypt?
I was saying that you last time you went to Boulaq el-Dakrur, I think. And you saw for yourself the situation now. I would like to put...
Well, I've many times been to slums, including the other Bolak, which is behind the Ramses Hilton, and all the other various areas which are so terrible in Cairo. Yeah, carry on, sorry.
Right.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
You said in one of your pieces, in one of your articles, I'd like to mention 3 points. In an article which you titled, "The Rotten State of Egypt is Too Powerless and Corrupt to Act." And you said at one point, open the Rafah gate or break off relations with Israel and Egypt's economic foundations crumble. Any Arab leader who took that kind of step will find that the West's economic and military support is withdrawn. Without subventions, Egypt is bankrupt. Is it that bad?
Well, if you look at the subvention that Egypt gets from the United States, and its general concern that if that subvention was withdrawn, other investment would dry up. Remember, investment in Egypt is contingent upon continued American support for Egypt. If America stopped that support, then many investors from outside other countries would say the same thing. Why do we want our new bank headquarters opening in Cairo, etc., etc.? The problem is that because the whole administration of Egypt is so sclerotic, but because the West needs Egypt as the middleman, the negotiator for peace with the Palestinians, etc., etc., a role which might soon be taken over by Turkey, as many Egyptians fear themselves, you've got a situation where the country never seems to have a future. I mean, okay, you can rely on tourism, and you've always got, you know, all the Westerners coming to look at the pyramids and go down to Luxor. But the truth of the matter is that you cannot base the future of a nation on the pharaohs who lived 3,000 years ago. You've got to base it on some image, some idea of what this country is going to become. Now, I don't think Mubarak is an intrinsically bad guy. I've met him. And if you compare him to most of the other regional autocrats, dictators, strongmen, call them what you like, he's quite a pleasant guy. He's not an intrinsically bad person, but the fact is he's ruled Egypt for far too long. There is a strong feeling among many Egyptians that Gamal is supposed to be the successor, making it the second caliphate in the Middle East, the first one being in Syria, where Bashar took over, of course, from Hafez. And it seems that it's very difficult to find an uncorrupted political entity in Egypt. I mean, the elections, this constant business of hearing 99.7, 98.2, 95.6, I mean, who's supposed to take this seriously? I mean, this is why al-Baradei will not commit himself to standing in a presidential election, although actually I don't think al-Baradei would make a terribly good president. I think we need a young person, but someone who is inspiring and who wants a genuine unity, and I haven't really seen that. But what distresses me in Egypt, as it does with all Arab countries, is that at the end of the day, if you pull out, you know, the winding piece of cotton, where is the problem? The problem is that it is just another country which is effectively subsidized by the United States to maintain US policy in the Middle East, which is the whole business about the Rafah issue, which is a shameful issue, frankly, and it must be a very, very, it must worry Mubarak a lot that he's had to adopt a situation in which basically Egypt supports the Israeli, European Union, American siege of Gaza, which of course you remember was initiated because the Palestinians in a perfectly fair election were stupid enough to elect the wrong people. They elected Hamas, they should have elected the Palestinian Authority. But going back to Egypt, you know, I gave a talk some months ago at the Opera House, and there were a lot of Mahabharat in the audience, one or two of whom I know actually, whom I've met and had coffee with in the past. And there they were, waiting to see what Mr. Robert was going to say. And the first question came from a female student in the audience. And she said, Mr. Robert, is Egypt a democracy? And my reply was, how quickly can I get from here to the international airport before I answer your question? It's not a proper democracy, no. It could be. Remember, Egypt has a great history in the 1930s of demanding democracy.
Yes.
And it was we Brits who encouraged democracy until that Egyptian democracy demanded the end of King Farouk's rule, at which point we got all the opposition whom we'd encouraged and put them into prison. And that basically is the same system that has continued in all the Middle Eastern countries ever since, with the exception, I suppose, of Israel and particularly of Lebanon.
It's a very useful diagnosis. And perhaps also, like you mentioned,
a diagnosis is meant to cure the patient, not Anyway, carry on.
Yeah, but you mentioned that it's like a bowl of cotton, and you don't know where to start. And well, I mean, if Robert Fisk doesn't have some sort of an insight as to, you know, and you also have the luxury of looking from the outside, coming, visiting, looking from the outside.
Look, let me interrupt you here. There's nothing particularly special about what I say about the Middle East, except I happen to have a newspaper, The Independent in London, which is ethical enough and brave enough, in my view, to print what I write as I write it. Most of my colleagues are under various constraints. They don't want to become controversial by writing something that will be criticized by the Israelis. You know, they have mortgages to pay off, kids to put through school and so on. Or newspapers which are known to be pro-Israeli, right-wing, and they don't want to get in a battle with their editors and so on. I'm not accusing the journalists of this, although I think that perhaps they should be a little bit more courageous. And I'm not the only journalist who's trying to do what I'm trying to do. The Guardian, for example, if you read Le Monde in Paris, if you speak French, if you look at some of the Italian Spanish papers, they're very good.
Because we're very much running out of time. We've got only like 20 seconds, and I would like to ask you this question. 34 years in the Middle East, based in Beirut, what have you learned?
That most people are basically good, but that the great crisis in the Middle East, I fear, is that a people who have not lost their faith in God, Muslims, are under the oppression and the power of a West which has largely lost its faith in God. And it must be very difficult for Muslims to ask themselves the question, why is it that we who still believe in God should find ourselves under the social, cultural, military, historical power of a people who largely do not believe in God? That, I suspect, is the real question that is going to have to be asked in the future.
Robert Fisk of The Independent, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.